This is Declarations.
I'm a big believer in that you live a legacy, you don't leave one. And so, it's how you're living now is going to define your legacy.
Hi, this is Todd Rich, and welcome to the Declarations podcast. Declarations is a podcast where top investors and business leaders share their insights and provide an independent perspective. Our goal is to uncover the stories behind their success and understand the principles that guide their decisions in life, family, and business. Through these conversations, we hope to become better investors. Today, we welcome Tripp Friedler, founder and managing partner of FreeGulliver, a multifamily office that works with entrepreneurial and multi-generational families on wealth strategy, investment decision-making, and long-term legacy planning. Tripp has spent more than 2 decades working at the intersection of law, finance, and family stewardship, helping families align their financial decisions with what truly matters: purpose, legacy, and impact. Tripp's unconventional background as a lawyer, restaurateur, insurance salesman, financial planner, and ultimately a trusted personal advisor offers us instructive lessons in how to follow your dreams and free yourself from the restrictive ties that often hold people back. Tripp shares his philosophy about creating a well-considered life in his book, FreeGulliver: 6 Swift Lessons in Life Planning. Tripp is also the author of a deeply personal memoir called The Tunnel, which focuses on his own family's resilient journey through mental health challenges. All proceeds from the sale of that book are directed to philanthropic causes. Tripp is a civic leader, philanthropist, and a founder of the Young Leadership Council in New Orleans. His work and writing reflect a deeply personal commitment to mental health advocacy, family, and intentional living. Please welcome Tripp Friedler and learn how to free your Gulliver. Tripp, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Todd.
Well, Tripp, you know this, but I'd like to start all of our conversations in the exact same way. What is your declaration?
Well, that's easy for me. I free Gullivers.
Okay, you free Gulliver. So I know what that means because I've read your book and gotten to know you. But for those who don't know, what does it mean to free a Gulliver?
So for those of our ilk, our ages, we all remember Gulliver, who was tied down, big guy, tied down by the Lilliputians, the little people.
Sorry, this is Gulliver from the Jonathan Swift book, Gulliver's Travels.
We all know it from the cartoon, or at least I know it from the cartoon that I used to watch as a little kid of Gulliver's Travels, where Gulliver was tied down on the island of Lilliput by the Lilliputians, who were tiny and unable to get up. And so I thought that image was a great image of this big guy tied down by all these little things. And we started a company that effectively tried to untie Gulliver, to remove those ties that bind, which we thought at the time, which I thought at the time were like, I could deal with your accountants and your lawyers and your investment people and your estate planning and put it all in one spot so you can be untied, only to learn as life went on that what really ties people down are themselves. And so that was the jumping off point. And that's where I feel, I do my best work when I'm able to help people get untied, so to speak.
So freeing people from themselves, presumably that's something mental or emotional. It's a block that we all impose on ourselves that holds us back. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I refer to it as a location. It's hard to go anywhere if you don't know where you are. As I like to joke, try making a reservation, call any airline and tell them that you want to go wherever you want to go, but refuse to tell them where you're leaving from, and you're going to have a difficult time making that reservation. So it's really the concept of really understanding where you are in all aspects of life, financially, emotionally, fiscally. And what I've discovered is the better understanding you have of where you are, the better able you are to get to where you want to go. So
let's come back and explore that notion of getting to where you want to go from knowing where you are. But let's start with where you came from, your early upbringing. I know you grew up in Louisiana. Why don't you tell a little bit about your early years, what you learned from your family as you were in your formative years?
Yeah. So I grew up in New Orleans, home of the Jazz Fest and the Mardi Gras. I grew up in uptown New Orleans, up by the park and Tulane University, for those who know, and had a really sort of idyllic childhood back in the day. Mom and dad, my brother, my sister, and I. And education was always very stressed in our family. I'd always known my whole life that my grandfather, actually my great uncles, but my grandfather, my dad all went to Exeter Prep School, all went to Yale, very successful, very intellectual. And so I always grew up with this notion of education being important. I can always remember my dad saying to me, all I can give you is a name and education, and what you do with that is up to you. My dad was very political.
But you were, just to be clear, you were the fourth generation of your family, I think, to go to Phillips at Exeter. And so obviously different from Louisiana, that's the Northeast. Did you feel pressure?
Yeah, I wouldn't so much call it pressure as I would inevitability. Like it never, I guess it was a form of pressure. It just is what men did in my family. So it just never occurred to me that that would not happen. I remember going to Boston and, I was young, maybe 12, 13, and we went to visit Exeter. I think I found a letter from my dad the week after I was born, informing Exeter that I had been born and that I was be registering for the class of 1978. So I wouldn't call it pressure.
That's the earliest application I've ever heard of.
Yeah, I know. I wouldn't call it pressure as much as inevitability.
Inevitability. And when you went there, I presume while it sounds like an important part of your family history growing up, I've got to imagine that actually attending boarding school away from your family in New England is different from growing up in the close-knit family that you experienced in the South, in New Orleans. How do you feel like the experience changed you or shaped you?
It was, to say it was different would be an understatement. I was a 16-year-old puka shell wearing, Jimmy Buffett, Leonard Skinner listening young man. And I get to Exeter, and there weren't many people in puka shells, and no one had even heard of Leonard Skinner, I don't think, and certainly not Jimmy Buffett. It was extremely eye-opening, and I didn't know anybody. And Dad didn't take me to Exeter. He put me on an airplane and said, someone will meet you in Boston at the airport, and got on a bus and went to Exeter. So it was eye-opening. To tell you the truth, though, it was invigorating because, anything new, while it's scary, is exciting. And so it was exciting to me. I'd never worked so hard in my life. I did well at Newman. Did very well at Newman, and at Exeter,
Newman's a school in New Orleans that you grew up
going to. School in New Orleans, famous for a lot of things. They're famous for the Manning brothers, famous for Odell Beckham in the New York area, but also Walter Isaacson, Michael Lewis. Newman has a long history in both intellectualism and, turns out lately, athleticism.
And that's even for people who don't go to Exeter.
Yeah. And people from Newman go to all kinds of good schools. Newman's a great, great, great school. Exeter is just in a whole different league, especially back then. And it was hard. It was really, really hard. Exeter, when I was there, had A, B, C, D, and E, no F. E was the varsity ladder. You didn't want to get that. They didn't believe in A pluses. It didn't exist when I was there. And A's were ever given out because Exeter's position was no one's perfect. So A minus was sort of the best grade you could get. That was the highest honor. And I was not in that group. I did graduate with honors, but not high honors or highest honors. But it was really, really hard. It was a very much an eye-opener for me. The greatest thing for me that happened at Exeter was the other inevitability in my family was Yale. Like, they all went to Exeter, they all went to Yale. And I was a big tennis player. I played tennis at Exeter. I wanted to play tennis in college. I could have played at Yale, but I would have probably ridden the bench a little more. But I went and took a weekend to Amherst with a friend of mine, a guy who had graduated the year before. And I get back from Amherst and I call my dad and I'm like, I'm not going to Yale, I'm going to Amherst.
Wow, what was the appeal?
I
What
had
did you?
just never, I mean, this is going to sound horrible, especially now that I have my own kids, but I don't think I'd ever had that much fun. And so
What?
I'm just thinking, this is really fun. And Amherst, to anyone who's ever been there, is just idyllic. It's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
It was small for a college. When I went, it was like, I think it was 1,600 people. So it was small for a college. And and Exeter was big for a high school. I mean, Newman, my class in Newman was maybe 90 people. And at Exeter, it was probably the same size as Amherst, 400 people. And so I just liked the fact that the professors would know my name. I went and looked at Yale because Dad made me, took me on a trip and said, okay, well, you can apply to Amherst, but you're going to go look at Yale. And so we went to look at Yale, and it's so funny looking back because I took my daughter on a trip, and Yale just seems so bad to me, such a not a great place. And maybe in the, early 80s, that's the way it was. But when I went back to look at it with my daughter in the 2000s, it was beautiful. And so obviously I had a frame of mind that I was not going to like Yale regardless.
And so just let's talk then about the family dynamic. So in some ways, the way you described the inevitability of going to Exeter then Yale could be described as almost ties that have you, tied down. You freed yourself from those ties. You chose to go in a different direction. And was that decision rewarded by your family? Did they feel like, wow, I'm so glad you're choosing individuality, or were they disappointed in you?
They were disappointed. My dad, to his credit, never made me feel less than. My grandfather had a little more trouble with it. And ironically, my grandmother on my mother's side, who had no horse in the race, she'd never really heard of Amherst. Amherst was a little school, and she's from Louisville, Kentucky, and she definitely had heard of Yale, and she thought I was making a horrible mistake. And I'll never forget, like maybe 3 years at Amherst, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, someone wrote an article about Amherst was the hardest school in the nation to get into. And my grandmother clipped it and sent it to me. And finally, had redeeming qualities.
You got accepted. You got accepted not just by the school, but by the family.
By the family. And so it was always ingrained in me that you had to succeed, right?
It's goals based. That's interesting.
And you had to succeed. And luckily for me, I was fairly successful.
It sounds like this worked out relatively well for you. So as you chose independence in one area of your life, in other words, Amherst, not Yale, you nonetheless felt the magnetic pull back in some ways to the expectations, right? And you came back to New Orleans. You became a lawyer, right? You studied law at Tulane. What was the original draw? Was that really because of these expectations in the family, or was it a different goal?
So I was graduating from college. I had no idea what I wanted to do, none. And I figured that if you want to go in business, you can just go in business. You don't have to go to business school to go in business. But if you want to be a lawyer, you got to go to law school. So let's just go to law school. And at the time, it's sort of interesting. There's a couple things that not many people know about. One, I produced a record for Island Records with a little band called the Blue Runners. But the other was, I was a fashion photographer. And so I used to do, it's interesting. I've always had the gift of gab. And as I like to say, I'm going to show my age here, but anyone could take a good picture of Christy Brinkley. The secret was talking her into letting you take her picture. And so I got lucky and I just, I started doing headshots for a modeling agency in New Orleans that had some really incredible models, many of which went on to GQ and Vogue and other things. So I built this incredible portfolio and was able to work. I went to Europe. I did work in Paris.
This is work that you did while in law school?
No, while in college.
While in college. Okay.
So, went to parties at Studio 50. I mean, it was crazy. I've always been able to talk myself into things I have no business doing. So when I was graduating from college, I figured, okay, I'm going to apply to 3 law schools. UCLA, because maybe I wanted to go to LA and continue this little gig I was on. Harvard, because everyone wanted to go to Harvard Law School. And Tulane, because I love New Orleans and it would be fun to be back.
So that's where you ended up. You came back.
I got into UCLA, did not get into Harvard, though one of my dad's friends who is a big Harvard guy wrote me a great letter, which I thought might work, which said, everyone has a bottom of the class and Tripp would round out the bottom of Harvard's class well, which I thought was cute, but didn't seem to work. So didn't get into Harvard Law School, but got into Tulane and went back home and studied law, and which I loved, actually. I loved studying law. I didn't.
But you hated being a lawyer.
Yeah, I didn't like practicing it. I just, maybe if I'd have been at a smaller firm and more entrepreneurial, I would have liked it. But I went to a big firm. My boss is still a friend of mine. He's brilliant. He clerked for Justice Berger on the Supreme Court. And we did First Amendment law, which he made sound very, very sexy. Turns out it's just tort law. I was in the library consistently researching true or substantially true for libel law, and it just didn't seem like that was going to work for me.
Well, so less than a year into your illustrious law career,
Yeah,
you
6
decided
months.
actually to go and switch, and you again were pulled by the ties of family and joined your father and your grandfather as an insurance salesman in their business. And so maybe you could explain what your thinking was.
I wanted to be entrepreneurial. I wanted to be able to be my own person, right? And be in charge of my own life, my own career. But it was also, when I look back, first of all, it was an amazing privilege to get to work with my grandfather. He was an amazing man. I had a very, very tight relationship with my grandfather. So I'm Frank Friedler III, right? And we had
Hence
Frank
Tripp,
Friedler.
I guess.
Yeah, Tripp for triple. We had Frank Friedler Jr. and we had Frank Friedler Sr. working there. So inevitably, people would call the office and say, I'd like to speak to Frank Friedler. And the receptionist would say, which one? And they would say, they would know my dad and my grandfather. So they would say, let's say they wanted my dad, they would say the young one. So they would get me. Or they would know me and my dad and say the old one, and they would get my grandfather. My dad in the middle rarely, unless they knew he was a junior, he rarely got those calls. But it was really a privilege. I can't tell you how much it meant to me to work, especially with my grandfather, who retired at like 92 probably, and I was in my 30s. Yeah, I was in my 30s. It was just a privilege to work with him. We worked on a couple cases together. It was a blast.
Well, now, so while you were doing this, and we'll come back to some of your feeling about the insurance business, because I sense there was a passion there. But as you alluded to, you had other passions. You had other business passions. I didn't know about the fashion photography, but I did know that you were in music recording, and then also ultimately were in the restaurant business. So what was the itch that you were trying to scratch here?
It's funny. I ask myself that question a lot. I don't know the answer, other than I was pulled by friends into those things. I've always been interested by a lot of different things. And so it was just a function. For instance, I had friends in the music business and they introduced me to Chris Blackwell, who came down for Jazz Fest one year. Chris Blackwell founded Island Records. He founded Bob Marley and Melissa Etheridge and Traffic and U2. Amazing guy. And he came and he goes, Tripp, you ought to be in the music business. And I'm like, Chris, I don't know the music business. He goes, it's a business like any other business. You'd be good at it. And so he convinced me to find a band and produce a band and manage a band in my part-time. And then the restaurant came about because my best friend since we were 5 and best man at my wedding was an unbelievable chef. Up in New York, he worked for Jonathan Waxman at Jams back in the 90s, and then Alfred Portali at Gotham Bar and Grill, just an amazing chef. And he wanted to come back to New Orleans. We had an opportunity to start a restaurant. We bought a closed restaurant and we started it. And so it was really working with friends and working with family that unites all those things. But at the end of the day, the restaurant was a hobby. The music was a hobby. The insurance was, became partners with my dad. And that's really where I spent the bulk of my time.
And you seem to love it right up, I guess, until your dad fell ill.
He got Alzheimer's. I'll never forget. I could tell something was off. Must have been 99, 2000. I had a place in Florida on the Panhandle near Grayton Beach. And dad and my stepmom, my mom died when I was 23. My dad remarried this great woman, Pam Davis Friedler, and they came down to the beach to be with us. And my dad and I took a long walk on the beach. It's very emotional because I sort of called him on his disease. I said, Dad, what's going on? Something's going on. And he explained to me he had Alzheimer's, and he was early 60s. I mean, it was young onset. And I'll never forget the line he told me. He goes, Tripp, I feel like a football player is in my prime and they're telling me I have to retire. And now I'm 66 and I can understand that because I feel like I'm in my prime. And, he got taken out of the game. And so when that happened, Todd, as much as I loved insurance, what I really figured out was what I really loved was working with my dad. And so when dad was gone, it wasn't as much fun anymore. It felt like work. And I've had a 38-year marriage. I've always loved relationships. My clients now are 30-year relationships with many of my clients. And so I felt like when that relationship ended, when Dan had to retire, it just wasn't fun anymore. And so a bank offered to buy the insurance practice. And at that point, I had been going to a coach called the strategic coach, Dan Sullivan, who's great. And he had convinced us to name what we were doing. And I was always more involved in people's estate planning, and insurance was the way I got paid, but I was always sort of involved in planning. And so whether it was corporate planning with using insurance as non-qualified deferred comp, or I was always involved in planning. And so I figured that's where I had a good friend, Josh Mayer. We were at lunch. I said, Josh, I have to really name what I do. And he goes, well, what exactly do you do? And I was explaining all the things I did. And he goes, well, it sounds like you free Gullivers. And I'm like, oh, that's good. And so that's where that started. And so we sold the insurance practice. And that's when I started Free Gulliver in 2000.
When was that? That was in
2000.
2000. So your friend, there are always relationships, as you mentioned, whether it's family or your friends got into this. Your friend said, hey, what you're doing is freeing Gullivers. And so that's what you decided. The plan here, I guess, was to create a wealth management firm. There's a psychological bent where you're trying to help people think through their life goals.
I had always been a personal investor. This was sort of the early 2000s where the life insurance business was morphing into financial planning. You were losing the pure life insurance guys and they were doing sort of financial planning. I was always a pure life insurance guy, but I'd always been an investor. We had a family partnership that I helped set up through my grandmother, and I was the managing director of that. And I'd always been an investor. And so I just felt like this was an opportunity to help people piece everything together in one place where you could have a trusted advisor who understood a lot of different elements of things.
The thought was that your approach to understanding clients' needs, clients' desires, and then obviously your experience in the insurance business would help you create a holistic wealth plan or estate plan for people.
Yeah, it was more when you handle people's life insurance, if you're good, what you really find is you're handling their dreams and aspirations, right? You're very involved in their lives. And so I had some really good clients. And by good clients, I don't mean rich clients. I mean good clients, good people. And I just felt like this was the next evolution in how I could help them. And so someone they could trust, someone who put their interests in front of anyone else's, and they could turn to not just for their investments or for their insurance or for their estate planning, but really could ask questions. I remember one client who sort of put the emotional stuff on the back burner. And then one day he calls me and he said, I don't really care that much about that. I just really like all these things you're doing. And then like 3 years later, he calls me. He goes, I've bought all my kids used BMWs on their 16th birthday. And now I'm wondering if that's the right thing to do. And I'm like, oh, wait. I thought we weren't talking about all these emotional things. And those are the kind of questions I would get. And those were the kind of discussions we would have. I think it was just the natural progression of handling people's life insurance and handling dreams and aspirations that fed me into this course.
Hi, this is Todd Rich, Thank you for listening to the Declarations podcast, where top investors and business leaders share their insights and provide an independent perspective. We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you'd like to learn more about Declaration Partners or listen to more episodes of the Declarations podcast, please visit our website at www.declarationpartners.com. And now back to the episode. I read your books, right? So we'll come to the Free Gulliver book in a second, but it strikes me when I read that book how different it is from some other wealth management books that I may have read, right? Which talk about portfolio theory or allocation. They talk about sort of retirement goals, estate planning, more technical analyses. And your book is fundamentally different. You actually have in your book worksheets or questions with blank lines that you ask people to answer. And it sounds, if I were to summarize, you ask for people to do a couple of things, but principally it's to clarify their vision, establish their location, and identify their passion. So talk about what do each of those things mean?
Yeah, it's a three-legged stool, really. So the theory is that in order to get anywhere, you got to know where you are, your location, right? You have to know where you want to go, which is your vision. And then you have to have enough fuel to get you there. And what I have found in dealing with all this was that people would lie about their location. I was going to write another book that calls You Are Where You Are, Whether You Know It or Not. But people would lie about their location, and they would lie to themselves, not even to other people. So
this was an intentional lie, or this is unintentional?
I don't know if it's intentional as much as it is fooling yourself, right? You can fool yourself. I mean, you can believe something to be true so much that in your mind it's true. So the example I would always give is if you were in New Orleans and wanted to go to New York, but you only had enough fuel to get you to Philadelphia, right? Then you needed to figure out how to get more fuel, right? But what most people would do is they would say, well, I'm not really in New York, I'm in Memphis. And so they would get on that plane, get up in the air as if they were in Memphis and try to go to New York. But the bottom line is they were in New Orleans. So they would crash and burn somewhere around Philadelphia. But they would kid themselves. And I find in my practice, most of what I was doing was trying to make people come to grips with where they were, what their true location was.
Maybe I'm confused a bit because I would think, if people are trying to establish goals, and I would suspect that many of your clients are ambitious and they have a vision, they have a sense as to where they want to go. This notion that they don't actually know where they are, I just want to push back. Is that because they truly don't know where they are, or because they're trying to project an image that they are somehow closer to their goals than where they feel? What's happening?
Yeah, I think they truly don't know where they are, or they want to be so badly to where they want to be that they are willing to sort of convince themselves that they're further along that path than they really actually are. And it manifests itself in many different ways. I mean, the guy who says, I want to retire at 60, first of all, there's so many different issues that float all around this. So also in the book is this whole notion of retirement, right? Because the definition of retirement back in the 1700s was to put out of service. If you retired a boat, or you retired your horse, or you retired whatever you retired in 1750, it wasn't coming back, right? People didn't retire from work, they died. And so people who wanted to retire and needed a certain amount would either, they obviously knew how much they had, but they could then convince themselves that they could make more money. They could earn 12% when really they should be thinking about 8. And so people tell themselves all kinds of little things to make them feel better about their condition.
And so how do you get them to see the truth?
I think you just have an open and honest discussion with people. It's always been helpful to me. So back at this, when I'm understanding all this stuff, I had an assistant getting her master's in counseling, and she saw everything I was doing, and she goes, these are courses you would like. And so I'm like, huh. So I went back to get that, to take all those courses. And it just started making me realize that people who dug deeper, people who understood themselves better, had a better chance of succeeding. And so I became, if you will, a very unlicensed therapist to my clients, helping them. The decision they thought they were making was not really the decision they were making. And so I got people to focus on the real decision as opposed to what they thought they were trying to do.
It's interesting to me. It strikes me that your view is that those counseling classes that you took are arguably more important than if you were to instead have taken CFA classes or, a Series 7 or 68, you'd say, look, that's fine. You learn some level of technical knowledge, but that isn't actually the missing piece. The missing piece is teaching your clients to figure out where they are, where they want to go, to have clarity around their goals. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, I actually took the Series 7 because back in the day I had to take it. I was with a broker dealer. I've taken courses. I've gotten all these different varying degrees, and there is nothing that has helped me more in life. Nothing that has helped me more in life than those courses.
How does that manifest itself into a practical meeting? You meet with a potential client, your first meeting, maybe you've had a nice referral or something, and they come to you and they say, Tripp, great to meet you, heard good things. I'm interested in growing my wealth X% or being able to retire and they focus on those sorts of typically financial questions that would go to a wealth manager. And you say, no, you've got it all backwards. And take me from there.
I don't actually tell them they have it all backwards. What I do tell them is, I say, that's interesting. Explain to me, what are we trying to accomplish here? Explain to me the notion of enough. So I switched the conversation to more conversations like that.
So how do you determine which type of client is a good fit?
Well, it's self-fulfilling because when I start asking a lot of these questions, a lot of people's eyes roll up in the back of their head, and that's the last conversation we're going to have. So it's sort of self-selecting, if you will. I mean, it's not for everybody.
Let's take this then into a different shift, which is now let's talk about your business model then, right? So when I think of a traditional wealth manager or investment manager per se, right? I think of someone who sets goals about growing assets under management fundamentally, right? I'm going to try and leverage myself or my team to have more clients, higher AUM. Maybe that's partly through higher returns. It's partly through sort of growing new clients. But you've just said that actually you're looking for only a specific type of client, right? That actually aligns with this philosophical vision. So talk to me how that changes the success model or the business model of FreeGulliver as a business. How do you measure your own success? It does not appear to be in terms of growth of the number of clients. Is it in terms of their satisfaction or fulfillment? Is it financial returns? How do you define it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I define my clients' success by how well they sleep at night, right? So if you sleep well at night, I've done a good job. If you're worried about a lot of things and you have a tough time sleeping, I'm not doing a good job.
But it does seem like you have a difficult role ahead, right? If the answer is that you want to be so intertwined with a client's philosophy to understand their vision, help them establish their location, ultimately to channel their passions, and you want to be their financial advisor, that might be a hard thing to scale. You'd need to make sure that the other people on your team are as deeply dedicated to the craft.
The fact of the matter is that I'm 66 years old and I want FreeGulliver to be enduring. I want it to go past me. So I brought in some younger partners. They're like, A, we need to charge more, and B, we need to get more assets under management. And so we do want to grow. We are growing. I mean, we're 20 people, most of which are, because we are family, we do a lot of family office work. So we only have maybe 4 investment advisors, and the rest are sort of back office or CFAs because we take investing seriously. We do all the normal things, which is, allocation models and alpha and beta and R squared and all the things that our investors are doing. We're really going through that right now, quite honestly, because it's very important to me as a company that we're perceived as a company that FreeGullivers. And so it's important for me, for everyone in our company to understand that's the core of what we do. And we don't like to take investments unless we have it all. right? Because we're I'm not going to be one of a million guys you have investments with. It's not what we do. Even if you want to give me, a fair amount of money, it's not what we do because I can't quarterback. We can't untie you if all we have is one string. And so we have to have access to all the strings and therefore we can't really do what we do if we're just gathering assets.
Let's shift for a second because you obviously brought up now how this business includes an investing component, right? Obviously, you do all of the different things investors do. Now, I've heard you talk somewhat about, you like to think about purpose-driven investing, which I guess shouldn't surprise listeners up to this point, given that much of what you talked about is finding purpose. So how do you help the families that you work with align their investing, their philanthropic giving with the values that you're trying to establish? How do you give them purpose through their investing?
Well, it's not so much through their investing because I don't believe that that's sort of the place to manifest purpose. I think purpose is way deeper than that. I think investing is the fuel in some cases that gets you to your purpose.
Investing well gives you, in other words, an asset base to then utilize for your. Okay.
To either give away or help your kids or whatever you want to do with your money, right? As I like to say, it's, everyone says it's all about the journey, except if you don't have the money to pay for the parking, you're not going anywhere. So you need to have the substance, you need to have the fuel, you need to have the money to accomplish many of the things my clients want to accomplish. So money is important. But one of my favorite lines of all times, I got from Howard Marks. He might have gotten it from someone else, but he says there's only two kinds of people who can help you with investing and give you advice: people who are wrong and people who are lucky. And so it's hard to figure out what's going to happen in the future, which is why diversification is so critical. But, you get rich by concentrating, but you stay rich by diversifying. And so working on all those plans, we have CFAs. I mean, we do a really good job there, a really deep, thorough, great job there. But that's not where the purpose comes in. That's the fuel that gets you to your purpose. So with my partners, some of them are more concentrating on the tactical stuff, right? Some of the investing stuff. I'm the guy they bring in to talk about purpose. We're very methodical. And look, I learned some hard lessons in investing. I mean, in 2008, I didn't understand credit, really, to be honest.
Well, neither did the rest of the world, apparently.
Right. Well, I certainly didn't. And so I was making investments, and it was a very humbling experience for me in 2008 when I realized I wasn't as smart. I was more lucky than smart. And that's when I started paying real attention to credit, which is a brutal way to learn that lesson, but I learned it and started investing in structured credit and understanding ABS and RMBS and all kinds of different kinds of credit and pay very close attention to interest rates. You guys helped me understand more about real estate and just a lot of different things. So investing is hugely important. It's a big part of what we do. It's just not a big part of what I do.
Right. Well, that's fair. So again, you're the purpose guy, right? And so you ended up turning this philosophy not just into a business, right? That's FreeGulliver, the business. But you also wrote a book, which we have alluded to. Your first book was FreeGulliver, 6 Swift Lessons in Life Planning, which in some ways reads like a financial planning book in the sense that you do talk about retirement and things like that. But it reflects more deeply, I think, this philosophy. And so given that in some way that's your special sauce, that's what your business is doing, why would you write it in a book for the whole world to see? What was the catalyst?
Well, I wanted to get my philosophy out there. It's more of a philosophy book. It's really interesting. I came up with all these different questions. They're all in the book. The book is now almost 20 years old. It still plays well. But one of the things in the book is, what are 5 things you'd really like to do if you had the money to do them? And so you get people to write those down, right? And then the next question is, how much money would it take to do it? And what I find inevitably is that most people have enough money to really do what they wanted to do, but they're not doing it. I mean, the classic example is, I always say I wanted to spend a month in France when I was younger. Every year I'd take my family, we'd rent a house and we'd spend a month in France. I'd learn French and blah, blah, blah. Well, I had the money to do that. Turns out I didn't really want to do that. I mean, it sounded good, but it's not really what I wanted to do. And so, those kinds of questions help. My favorite is, I'm a big believer in that you live a legacy, you don't leave one. And so, it's how you're living now is going to define your legacy. And so I had this is in the book. I had this client, a great woman, great kids. And I asked her, what is it about you that you would like your kids to know? List 3 or 4 things, 5 things, I said, that you'd like your kids to know. And then we would talk about that. And then I would say, do they know these things? And she'd say no. And I'm like, well, why don't you write them a letter and tell them what you would like them to know about you and put it in your will? And she goes, well, that's a good idea. And then I said, well, instead of putting in your will, why don't you send it to them now? Why wait until you die? And so it's that whole notion of living a legacy, not leaving one. And I think I explore that in the book, the legacy. The chapters are, which we talked about, location, vision, and purpose, and fuel, if you will. But then the other 3 chapters are retirement, legacy, and risk, right? And risk is another interesting one because every decision you make has risk. There's the risk of doing it and the risk of not doing it.
True opportunity cost.
And so people always focus on the risk of doing it as opposed to not doing it. And I always like to say on your deathbed, no one has ever said, I wish I'd taken less risk. And so that's a fascinating notion for me as well, talking about this notion of risk. And so I wanted just for people to understand as they go about making plans, the more they know these things, in my opinion, the better the plan they can make and the better life they could live, quite honestly.
So in many ways, that book, right, your first book, FreeGulliver, is about planning for the future. I'm going to switch now to your other book, which is almost the opposite, right? Your next book, which we alluded to earlier, The Tunnel, deeply, deeply personal memoir about your family life, your struggle, ultimately culminating in some sense with the death of your son. Although you made it clear that there's a hopeful notion to this, right? A story of resilience and getting through. I'm going to actually read the end, which is, I think, the most hopeful message I've heard, the description that you've made at the end of the book, which is that the tunnel is a story of taking that grasp of air at the end of a tunnel, a breath that says you are alive. You made it through your own tunnel of darkness, and you will find happiness on the other side. What does that mean to you? What does that phrase evoke?
So I think life is defined by how we overcome challenges. I think that's ultimately life is defined. And we all want to believe that we can overcome challenges, but very few of us are given the privilege to actually have it happen, right? And so what that means to me is that in order to turn something really horrible into something that's meaningful, you have to find the meaning in it, right? You have to find the meaning. And when you do, and you absorb it and you learn from it, you become a better person for it. So to me, getting to the other side is just so life affirming and so fulfilling.
So was writing the book your path to finding meaning out of this tragedy?
Yeah, it really sort of was. I mean, I wanted to write a book about, I am in business, so I wanted to somehow take my son's tragedy and meld it into my business practice, sort of like a new FreeGulliver kind of book, and, dealing with the notion of enough and all these things. But anyone who's ever written anything knows that the story takes you where the story wants to take you. And so this story didn't want to take me there. This story became one of self-exploration. And it's self-exploration in a very public way, because obviously it's a book that's out there. I've had people tell me I was too hard on myself or, all kinds of things, or how could you be that open and you really overshared, and which I don't believe is possible.
There's certainly vulnerability. You certainly
Yeah.
allowed yourself to be vulnerable
Right.
in a
But that's the
professional.
only way. I don't know, Todd. I'm a big believer that the more you hide, the harder life becomes. And so you are who you are, right? And the more you try to hide it, life just gets hard.
So don't lie about your location,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Let people
Exactly.
know where you are,
Yeah,
including yourself.
I
Yep.
like to joke, how great would it be to have an ego so big it disappears, right? And I'm a long way from that. But it's very rewarding to go back and really explore truth and my truth and what happened to me. And people have told me over and over and over again, because I've spoken a lot about this, that, how brave I was to write the book. And I just feel I don't argue that point anymore because people get upset with me when I argue that point. But I don't really feel it was brave to write the book as much as when you consider everything that I got from writing it, the clarity I got, the peace of mind I got, the ability to hold my son in a place that's close to my heart, that doesn't break it. It's just such a gift that I got that I feel like a fraud when people say how brave I was, because I just don't feel that way, right?
The thing, though, that I'd like to explore, because it's so interesting that, your first book really talks, and your business, the way you talk about it really talks about this living life with a deep level of intentionality about your life and about your planning for the future, right? And yet the tunnel tells you that despite all the planning, you really can't be prepared for everything in life. The future will happen, but life is inherently unpredictable. And so that's a dichotomy,
That's
both.
that's a big dichotomy. And let me tell you, I would imagine most of your listeners, certainly myself, I'm a bit of a control freak, right? I mean, I like to plan, and as much as I might sound, all this new age, I'm a very much of a planner, right? I'm a control freak. I like to control my environment. I like to control my results. I like to be in charge. And so you go through something like this and it slaps you in the face that you really have very little control of things. I fought that. If you read the book, you'll find out I fought that hard, because you really don't have any control, which is a scary, scary thought. But you're 100% right in the sense that it took me going back and learning that I still like to control things. I mean, that hasn't changed. I'm just more accepting when it doesn't maybe go my way. There's a great line by James Hillman in a book called The Soul's Code, which says, visible failures mask invisible fates. And we never know what is perceived as a failure at that moment in time. Is it really, or is it just what needed to happen to get you to the next place? Right. And so I struggle with all these things. We all try to be the best person we can be and put our feet forward in the best ways we can, to be good husbands and to be good parents and to be good friends. I think we all struggle with that, but I think that's the struggle we're struggling for. I mean, I really do. And I think in writing this book and going backwards, as you point out, which is accurate, and trying to explore how I got to where I am, it released me in some ways. It freed many, many strings, to be honest. It definitely made me a better person. I think it made me a better advisor, to be honest.
Well, let's now talk, because I think there's more to your life than just the family and the advice that you give. Maybe the books helped you free your own strings, but in your philanthropy, which I know is important to you, you could argue you're freeing other people's strings. And so you've been involved in a variety of philanthropies. And I'd say there's a particular focus on your hometown, which clearly you love, New Orleans. There, you were one of the founders of the Young Leadership Council. So can we just spend a second talking about what that organization does and why it means so much to you?
Yeah, this is interesting. You see certain, I hate to use the word strings, but certain strings that are throughout my life. And one of them is impatience. And so this was 1986. I'm 26 years old. It had just come off a mayoral election in New Orleans, where a lot of us had been involved in trying to elect the candidates of our choice. And now the election was over, and we wanted to be involved in our community, but we were too young, we were told, right? If we wanted to join, the business council or the chamber of commerce, we had to go pay our dues. And so there were about 5 or 6 of us, and we were very impatient and really didn't want to pay those kinds of dues. So we thought we would start our own organization. And ironically, we wanted the cutoff to be 40, but the first president,
Meaning at the upper end. You didn't want people to be able to get in at 40.
At 40, you couldn't be a member anymore. And so, but our president was going to be 42. And so if you look at our bylaws, it says 42, which people probably go, why that number? And that's why that number. But, it was great. We wrote bylaws. We created a foundation. We said that 50% of everything didn't get spent went into a foundation, which is now in the millions. It was very entrepreneurial in a way, philanthropically entrepreneurial, but nonetheless entrepreneurial.
So what does it do?
It does a lot of things. So if you come to New Orleans and you see the Mississippi River Bridge all lit up, we did that. Our first project was public schools. Anyone whose kids are in private school, certainly, you get a manual when you show up the first day at school, all kinds of rules, regulations, who to call, what to do. I know Newman had a manual, but public schools didn't have one. And so we created a manual for public schools. That was our very first project. But the Sports Foundation in New Orleans, which is still in existence, but is its own organization now, we created that. We created Beautify New Orleans. It's just a way for young people under 40, under 42 technically, but probably under 40, to
have an impact,
in the city of New Orleans.
And are you still involved? You just mentioned your age, right? For people who
I'm not still involved.
Okay. You aged out.
I'm not. I support them, but I'm not still involved. I'm way, way, way past the age of membership.
That's okay. It's great to help out. And I know you advise your clients as well, philanthropically. I've really enjoyed this conversation because I think it gave me and our listeners so much insight to you personally and to the philosophy that you have with FreeGulliver, including planning for the future and the unpredictability that's inherent in that exercise. But it's come time for our closing questions. So maybe if you could give me a book that most influenced your thinking or your personal development.
Right. I have 2 because it's tough. I read a lot of books, but I would say The Soul's Code by James Hillman. Great book. And probably maybe my number 1 would be Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I mean, that's just an amazing book. Anyone who hadn't read it needs to read it. Here's a man who lost everything in concentration camps and came out optimistic.
He lost everything except the one thing you need, which is hope.
Yes, exactly.
What is the best advice that you've received from your parents or that you now give to your own children?
So the best piece of advice I got from my grandfather was a business piece of advice, which I love, which is you make your money in your business and lose it in someone else's.
What did he mean by that?
Well, I'll give you an example. So I have plenty of clients who'd say, well, I have all this money to invest. I'm like, well, why not invest it in your business? Like, why give it to me? Put it back in your business. That's the best investment you can make. But I just think you should invest in yourself first. And then everything comes second. And that came from my grandfather, which I thought is the best piece of advice ever. And then my dad's advice was, which I already said, was that all he could give me was a name and an education. And what I did with that was up to me. And that stuck with me. And the advice I give to my kids, or really anybody who will listen to me, is it's really hard to get rich quick, and it's really easy to get rich slow.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. As you know, I have a quote from Charlie Munger up on my desk, and it says, the first rule of compounding is to not interrupt it unnecessarily.
Right. And it's just, if you do the right thing for long enough periods of time, you will do fine. Don't ever be short-sighted. So that's the best. I give that advice to my kids constantly.
Last question. The most famous sentence in the Declaration of Independence talks about our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Tripp, what do you do in pursuit of happiness?
I spend as much time as I can with my granddaughter. That's my pursuit of happiness. It's my first grandchild. They live in Chicago, and we rented an apartment. I went to my son-in-law because it was 2 blocks from their house. And I'm like, is this too close? Because I don't want to be that guy. And he goes, no, it's not too close. And so I pick her up during the summers, or every time I'm there, I'd pick her up every day at daycare, sometimes with my daughter. Sometimes she's nice enough to let me go by myself. And to have a relationship with my grandchildren like I had with my grandfather, that circle is hugely important to me. And that's my pursuit of happiness. For my grandchildren to eventually say they had the kind of relationship with me that I had with my grandfather means the world to me. That means everything to me.
What a beautiful way to end this fantastic conversation about life and family and vision. It is clear that you know your location, Tripp, and I hope that for you and your clients, you're able to all have the fuel to get to where you're going.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Todd. This has been great. Thank you.
This podcast is provided for discussion and informational purposes only, for use by Declaration Partners LP, together with its affiliates, referred to as Declaration. The information discussed in this podcast may change at any time without notice, and there is no duty by Declaration to update any person to whom this information is provided. This podcast does not constitute an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to purchase any investment product or any interest in the fund or any other investment vehicles or accounts managed or advised by Declaration, a Declaration investment product, in any jurisdiction to any person. Any such offer or solicitation for interest in any Declaration investment product will only be made pursuant to such Declaration investment product's definitive offering documents, which contain a description of the material terms, including risk factors, conflicts of interest, fees and charges, and regulatory and tax considerations relating to such Declaration investment product, and which should be reviewed carefully by potential investors prior to making an investment decision. This podcast does not constitute tax or legal advice. The listener is urged to consult a professional tax and/or legal advisors regarding the possible tax, legal, economic, regulatory, or other risks and consequences associated with any investment, and must be able to bear the risks involved. This podcast may contain certain forward-looking statements, which constitute Declaration's views with respect to future events, which can be identified by the use of forward-looking terminology, such as intend, seek, expect, target, project, or endeavor. These statements are made based upon such views as they exist as of the date herein. There is no assurance that such views are correct or will prove, with the passage of time, to be correct. Actual events or results may differ materially from those contemplated by such forward-looking statements as a result of factors beyond Declaration's control, including, without limitation, any disruptions in global, regional, or local financial, credit, or real estate markets, acts of God, fire, hurricanes, tropical storms, floods, earthquakes, or other natural disasters, outbreaks of an infectious disease, pandemic, or any other serious public health concern, war, terrorism, labor strikes, electricity shortages, or other national or local emergencies, or any combination of the foregoing. David M. Rubenstein is an anchor investor in Declaration Partners Real Estate Fund 2 and is not an employee of Declaration. Neither the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission nor the Securities Regulatory Authority of any state or other jurisdiction has passed upon the accuracy or adequacy of this podcast. No compensation has been awarded to any speaker for statements made that are either testimonials or endorsements. However, certain speakers may be current or former investors in certain Declaration investment products and may receive reduced fees, priority terms, priority access, co-investment rates, among other preferential treatment, which may pose a conflict of interest. Certain speakers may also be affiliates and/or service providers that receive compensation from Declaration for services provided in their service provider capacity, but have not been compensated specifically for any testimonials or endorsements made herein. The views expressed in this podcast by either the guest speaker or the host are their own and may not reflect the views of their firm or its affiliates or of Declaration. The comments made are for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered investment, legal, or tax advice, nor a recommendation or offer to buy or sell any security or investment product. Any references to advisory services, private investments, or wealth management practices are general in nature and not indicative of future results. Past performance is not indicative of future outcomes. Examples and observations shared by the guest speaker are illustrative only and may not reflect actual client experiences. Listeners should consult their own professional advisors regarding their individual circumstances. The guest speaker may have professional relationships that could present potential conflicts of interest related to statements made by the speaker. Consequently, from the foregoing, no reliance whatsoever should be placed on this podcast, and no decision, including any investment decision, should be made based on this podcast or on the information contained herein.